That particular Beatles song provided our guest today with the name of his radio program. And he's still going strong in radio 35 years later. Now, you may remember Ken Michaels, the host of the Beatles program Every Little Thing, from his days on WDHA or on Long Island's WBZO, or maybe even from the syndicated version of his show, which airs on this station, WFDU. I figured that today we'd talk a little bit about that and also what was going on in the world of the Beatles back in 1982. Ken, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ghosty. Great to be here.
So I'm going to guess that back in 1982, you said to yourself, I love the Beatles, I've got all of these records, and I love radio. Let's do something about this. Let's put them together.
Well, actually, this may surprise you, but I knew that I wanted to have a career on the air as a DJ, and I was working at my college radio station at New York Tech in Old Westbury, Long Island, and I was doing various formats, especially on the weekends, and everybody there kind of knew I was a Beatle fan from playing their music on the air and also wearing Beatle shirts. And I had a friend of mine who was the program director at the time who suggested that I do a Beatle show, and I hadn't really thought about doing it because I didn't really know of any weekly Beatle shows that were on the air. Maybe Ringo's Yellow Submarine was on around that time.
Yeah.
But I started doing it on Sunday nights, and I was on from 10 to 1, the least desirable shift of the week. And from 1 to 6, they ran automation. So I took the last hour from midnight to 1, did an hour of Beatles, mixed group and solo together. The phones were dead. And then I suggested to my friend, the program director, why don't I move it to 10 o'clock? And when I did that, the phones lit up like crazy. And so the show became a 3-hour show from 10 to 1. And we got a great audience, despite the fact that the frequency only really reached around the college campus. It was actually on cable television. You heard just the audio. And as a matter of fact, in the beginning, it was just a mono signal, too. But we developed an audience with the show. I had a friend of mine who I had just met recently who I discovered was a huge Beatle fan and knew all the solo music. We became a team on the air for about a year. And after he left, I was debating whether or not I was going to do the show ever again. And I just kept doing it. And the first radio station I sent an air check to was WDHA in New Jersey. And the program director at the time was Mark Chernoff. And he took my show. It ran for 10 years there. And then it went on the air on B103 on Long Island, which at the time was an oldie station. And later I was heard on XM radio for 6 years. And the last 5 years I've been on WNHU in West Haven, Connecticut, doing a live show of it. And also developing it as a syndicated show where it's now heard on its 26 stations as of today. And the similarities are that there are thematic sets that I do on the live show and both the syndicated show. On my syndicated show, the last segment, it has a theme to it. So there's all kinds of unique themes that I throw into the show, as you know. Right. And I think one of the big influences on me, which I never realized at the time, was a book that came out in 1975 called All Together Now.
Sure,
which was, a discography of the Beatles group and solo music up to that point, but it also included side projects that the Beatles were involved with, recordings on Apple Records, and I started to think to myself, that really is all one catalog to me. So I never really separated the group from the solo. It was all one work, and I mixed it all together.
We're talking to Ken Michaels, host of Every Little Thing, both the live and syndicated radio shows. Now, listeners to this program know that interviews are my bread and butter. So, Ken, give us a little rundown of the many guests you've had on the program.
Through the years, well, there was Ringo.
Right, yeah.
I can't beat that. Let's see. Carl Perkins was a real highlight for me. The many members of Wings. Denny Seiwell, Denny Lane, Lawrence Juber, Steve Holley, members of Elephant's Memory, Gary Van Sciok, Adam Ippolito, Billy J. Kramer I've interviewed, a lot of Beatle authors. There's a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, Peter Asher, Mark Hudson, the list goes on, and folks can go to your website, kenmichaelsradio.com, and listen to a lot of those interviews. All right, let's change gears and talk about what was happening in the world of Beatledom back in 1982 when you first began doing radio?
Well, Paul McCartney released his Tug of War album, which to me I think is one of his finest, and for many years it was my favorite of his, until Flowers in the Dirt.
You're right. And Tug of War was an album that was popular with critics and fans alike when it was initially released, and over time that hasn't diminished. People still consider that one of Paul's best.
Yeah, for a lot of reasons. Song for song, it's such a solid album. And he reunited with George Martin
for
the album. And when it comes to songs that require orchestration and a brass arrangement, who's more suitable for Paul than George Martin? And, the arrangements and the production on so many songs, from Wanderlust to Ballroom Dancing, Here Today, the title track, those arrangements were just perfect for Paul.
It's a tug.
We just heard the title track from Paul McCartney's 1982 album, Tug of War, and that was the single version of the title track. The big single off that record was his duet with Stevie Wonder, Ebony and Ivory, which was number one in the U.S. for 7 weeks. There was another Stevie Wonder duet on there called What's That You're Doing, and I like that one too. So we're talking with Ken Michaels about Beatle highlights of 1982. Any more?
Tug of War was the big highlight for me, and another album that was Gone Troppo.
Now, there's an example of a George Harrison solo album that's undergone a massive critical reappraisal, because back in 1982, that album was either ignored or it wasn't favorably reviewed.
No, and part of the reason was George himself not promoting it. He was at the end of his record contract with Warner Brothers, and so he really didn't care anymore, and he just put out an album because it was an obligation. But you never know it from the songs, because they're still wonderful songs and they're produced really well. And I think George's albums are just so consistently strong throughout his solo career. We all have our favorites,
right.
But I really love just about every album he's done, and there really isn't a song on Gone Troppo that I don't care for. And I love, his masterful slide guitar work. It's a lot of the albums that he did, especially on the Dark Horse label, have such a laid-back, relaxed feel to them.
Right.
Like you're in Hawaii with him or something. You're on an island with George.
You're living up to the title, yeah.
Yeah, true. And so I love that album to death, too. Those are two really great albums.
WFDU FM.
That's us, and we're back talking to Ken Michaels as he celebrates his 35 years in Beatles-oriented radio. And we've been talking about some of the highlights from Beatledom in 1982, the year that he first began in radio. And it was the dying days of the thematic compilation that Capitol Records would put together, and one of the last ones was Real Music, which as a concept is kind of a weak one, songs that were used in Beatle movies. But I think what ruined this whole project for people was the Beatles movie medley 45.
It certainly has turned me off. I think it was. Let me tell you something, Ghosty.
Sure.
At the time, I was a few years into doing radio at the college radio station, and I lived in the production studio. And in those days, as you know, everything was on reel-to-reel.
Right.
And I'm the most critical person you'll ever find of my own production work. I could have done a better job with the Beatles movie medley than Capitol Records did. I really hated it.
Well, I'll tell you what, this probably hasn't gotten much airplay since 1982. So here it is, folks, in all of its clumsy glory, the Beatles movie medley. Well, there you go, the dubious Beatles movie medley, which has since been deleted. You can't purchase that anymore, thank goodness, because that and the Real Music album, which was kind of a waste of time. Anyway, by the way, that was inspired by the success of the Stars on 45 Beatles medley, which was a huge, it went to number one.
Well, when you're dealing with Beatles songs, you're dealing with different speeds and tempos. and you have to try to slow down one and speed up another one to try to make it work.
Right.
But if you've got a danceable beat in the background, you can work wonders and blend so many songs together. And I think that's where Stars on 45 succeeded. Real music was really a waste of time, like you said. And I think I reached a point by then where these thematic albums, I loved rock and roll music. I thought it was a great idea. I loved love songs, grouping them together. But I think it started to run its course by then. And, to do real music and then 20 greatest hits, which I think is actually a great idea. And every time that, people bring up the Beatles 1, I always say, well, that was 20 greatest hits.
Yeah, and isn't it strange that 20 Greatest Hits comes out in 1982? I bought it, but hardly anyone else did. I mean, it didn't do all that well. The same concept in 2000, and the Beatles 1 is like one of the biggest selling catalog greatest hits records of all time.
Well, you never know from decade to decade how well the Beatles music is going to sell. Every now and then there's a resurgence, and then there's a lull. I really think in the 80s there was a lull. And then it picked up again in the 90s when you had Live at the BBC and the Beatles Anthology.
Right.
I think that helped tremendously. And, I think especially the Beatles 1, nobody could have seen the success of that coming.
Oh, I remember all the articles in Beatle Fan. Why is this happening? What a wasted opportunity. Who's going to buy the Beatles 1? You can just get the past masters and the CDs are out there. And then lo and behold, this thing comes out and it blows the doors off everyone's expectations.
I've been wrong twice about this. I never thought the Beatles 1 was going to be the success that it was. And when I heard 1 Plus was coming out, I thought that was going to explode.
Yeah, and the problem with that is they waited too long. The home video market, especially for music videos, is just dead.
Yeah, videos don't matter like they used to.
Yeah. And you mentioned the anthology back in the 90s. In 1982, we got a documentary on the Beatles called The Complete Beatles.
Yeah, it was okay for its time.
Well, they don't have much in terms of footage, but at the time, there really wasn't anything readily available about the group.
You've got me curious now. I haven't watched The Complete Beatles in so long.
Yeah, it's still pretty good. We're talking to Ken Michaels. He's celebrating his 35th year in Beatles-centric radio, and we've got one last thing to talk about as we wrap up our look back at the year 1982 in Beatledom. And I don't know if this was more of a UK promotional campaign, but I seem to recall some of it in the US. There was a lot of hubbub and buzz about the 20th anniversary of the group's first single, Love Me Do. In fact, they would re-release the single, and, there's a big promotion. It was 20 years ago today.
Well, I remember that.
Picture disc, too.
Yeah, that's true. I have that, and they made a video for that,
yes,
which was shown on MTV.
Yep.
Yeah, I just don't know how successful that was, but it was the first time I can remember there being a push with an anniversary of any kind.
Do I have this correct? Did they use the album version as the single? Did they get it backwards?
I think they used the one with Ringo on drums, I think.
Okay. So
have to go back and watch.
Now I'm thinking which is which. Wait a minute. Is the single with Ringo? No, the single's with Andy White.
The single in America was Andy White.
Right. Oh, my God.
The single in Britain was Ringo.
Right. This is so confusing. So as we wrap up here, we mentioned the show. Let's mention the website and where people can find out about what you're doing and maybe hear some of those past interviews.
The website is kenmichaelsradio.com, and there's several pages of interviews that you can click on. Just so many people in the Beatle world, and lots of Beatle authors, too. There's also Beatles trivia that I feature every single week on the website where you can win one of 9 prizes. And they're all amazing prizes, everything from CDs to DVDs to books. The trivia ranges from week to week, whether it's intentionally easy or very challenging. I have special contests where I give away all kinds of unique prizes, sometimes signed copies of books by the authors. I just gave away several vinyl copies of George Harrison's solo catalog. And I'm going to be having Paul McCartney's Flowers in the Dirt, the special edition that I'll be giving away on the website, too. Plus, there's constant information on the website of Beatles tribute bands and people related to the Beatles, work with the Beatles if they're going to play in our area. By that I mean New York, New England,
Right.
and New Jersey. That's on the website. So there's plenty there to chew on.
Oh, and one last thing. We need to mention the podcast you do every week, along with Alan Kozin, Al Sussman, and Steve Marinucci, Things We Said Today.
Yeah, well, the show started 4.5 years ago with just me and Steve. I wanted to do a show that was more Beatles news-centric, and that's what it was for a couple of years. And then we added Al and Alan, and the topics can be anything about the past, present, and the future. We review Beatles music, solo music. We talk about things to come, things like that. It's really unlimited what you can talk about, especially once you open up the gates to all the solo music.
Yeah.
So you can find the show on Podbean, PODBEAN.com. It's also on iTunes, and the audio only of it is on YouTube. So we have a new show every single week, and we've been gradually building an audience. People discovering our show more and more. I know that you listen.
I do. I listen every week.
You told me you listen to every Beatles podcast there is?
There is, yeah, every single one.
Well, if you listen to all the Beatles podcasts every single week, you can't possibly be married.
I'm not, no.
Well, that's it.
And I never will be at this rate. All right.
If you were married, you'd never have the time for it. But.
There you go. All right. Well, Ken, thanks so much for being on the show today and chatting about not only your history in broadcasting and celebrating your 35th anniversary on the air, but also what was happening in the world of the Beatles 35 years ago in 1982.
Thank you, Ghosty. It's a pleasure being on.